Hello, hello. ETH Belgrade. Thank you guys for having me. Thanks for being here. Day 3, final stretch. I know you'd rather be outside drinking a beer somewhere, so thanks for being here. Like you said, my name's Sam Richards. I work at the Ethereum Foundation. Specifically, I work at PSE, Privacy and Scaling Explorations. We build public goods on Ethereum using programmable cryptography. And today I want to talk to you about voting, and specifically the potential or the promise of blockchain voting. And I think it's still somewhat of an open question, right? Like, what is the potential of blockchain-enabled voting? If you do some quick Googling around, I think you'll find a range of takes on it. Even a few years ago, you had states in the US exploring pilot projects. You had countries around the world. Like India just wrapped up, I think, the largest democratic election in the history of humanity. Spoiler alert, they did not use blockchain-based voting. They did explore it. So I think many examples of like interest and engagement in it, but you'll also see takes that basically just say, this is a horrible idea. Like, we should not run elections on a blockchain. A lot of journalism's covering this. Even prestigious institution. This is a screenshot from a paper from a bunch of MIT researchers back in 2020, basically saying, like, this is a bad idea, guys. Like, just stop it. Stop it. So what I want to do is kind of explore this landscape a bit, see what people have been saying, what my thoughts on it are. What are some of the advantages? What are some of the challenges we see with this technology? And hopefully give you some information for you to kind of decide on your own of like, what is the promise of this stuff? So starting with the why work on voting? If I can get a little existential for a moment, like, why crypto? What are we doing here, guys? What is the potential of this industry, this technology, right? Is it improving money and finance? I think we saw with Bitcoin kind of emerging from the financial crisis of 2008, a specific focus on the financial system, and I think already we've seen incredible progress in that space in terms of just like improving those systems, making them more transparent, more efficient. But I think a lot of us think, hey, like, we could probably do something bigger, right? Like, could we build a bigger internet? Could we build a better world? One that embodies these values of open source and transparency and just like inclusivity. I think bringing it back to voting, like, a lot of us see this as a really compelling use case for this technology. So why work on it? I mean, in short, I think voting's important, right? Even taking a look at like elections specifically, like, who here is voting this year or has already voted? Most of us, right? I took this picture this week. I heard Belgrade even had some local municipal elections a couple days ago, right? It's something a lot of us go through. But what's the problem? I think in short, like, voting is pretty hard. It's a simple concept, but once you get into the details of how to run, say, an election process, things actually get really complex and really difficult. And for the centuries or millennia that we've been, experimenting with different forms of democracy, there's been a ton of experimentation and a ton of just time, energy, resources, institutions, governments, right? Like creating regulation, laws, processes to really try to uphold the integrity of these election processes. And thankfully, like, this isn't the experience most of us get at the ballot box, thankfully. Hopefully, it's something more like this, a picture from an election in Taiwan earlier this year where you have some order and privacy. But I think what we see is even in, the supposedly like most advanced democracies and nations in the world is like just a lack of trust and, belief in the fact that these processes are being running fairly and consistently. So if we kind of take a step back and think about from first principles, like what does a voting process even need, right? I think the TLDR, it just has a high need for process integrity. Today, I'll focus on these 4 dimensions, which I think are particularly important for voting. First being correct execution. Pretty straightforward. All these kind of are, but correct execution means, right, like the votes should add up to the correct result, right? Like when we do the tallying of all these submissions, all these ballots, that should be correct. And ideally, that whole process should be transparent so that everyone can buy into the fact that it's correct. Censorship resistance, a phrase we hear a lot in the blockchain space, right? Of like, anyone who is eligible to vote should be able to vote, right? Pretty simple. No one should be able to prevent your ability to vote. And once you cast your vote, no one should be able to rip up your ballot or delete your record in some database, right? You should have the ability to actually be able to vote. Privacy, a big one, right? No one should be able to see how you voted. You should be voting because of how you feel about a certain issue, not because you're worried about what your neighbor thinks or your employer or your government or some gang down the street. And you probably shouldn't be able to see how other people are voting. We don't want this kind of like crowd herd mentality of, okay, I'll just vote for whoever the influencers are voting for because that's the safe bet, right? Like we want to ensure the integrity of these processes. Lastly, collusion resistance. Basically, it should not be easy to bribe or coerce someone. And that's key is like you really shouldn't be able to prove to someone else how you voted. You shouldn't be able to just take a picture of your ballot and send it to someone so that you can get paid for that. So if we look at those 4 dimensions, we can put them in a nice little table and we can start to compare some approaches. In-person voting, how most of this goes today. Basically, I think the short is like we don't really know, right? Governments, institutions put a lot of money and effort into this, but ultimately we're kind of just trusting them to run things correctly. And there's really no way for us to verify or like hold them accountable that they're not censoring votes, that they're not, revealing our votes to third parties. We don't really know. Shrug emoji. How about digital voting? I think most of us here are probably internet native folks. I think with the movement of all our lives into the digital realm, like we kind of see the benefits of potentially doing digital voting. Efficiency, accessibility for the most part, integrating these experiences into existing services, right? Like I think a vast potential here. Environmental benefits. To me, the most interesting, I think, is just like if we can make these processes much more efficient, we can do them much more often. And that empowers us to just do more things in a democratic manner, right? Like most of us vote once every few years, right? Like what could we do? What could we accomplish if we could vote much more often at smaller scales, more adapted to the information each of us have available? I think we can all agree just a lot of potential here. But at least with the platforms in place, again, we don't really know. It's mostly trusting some party to just do everything correctly and not cheat us. So I think one question that comes to mind, we all love blockchain here probably. I think we're bought in, but like, should we just stamp a blockchain on everything and say it's better? Is it possible without one? People have been looking into this solution, researching this stuff for over 20 years. And it's hard to kind of summarize and generalize across all that vast research. But I think in short, like, yes, there have been solutions, but broadly, the bad news is they all make certain trust assumptions. A lot of these protocols have similar designs in terms of just like encrypting votes, so we protect privacy. Usually there's some agreed on set of talliers with some honest majority assumption. And this is, again, to like make sure there's no one central party who we have to trust. And they generally rely on this primitive that is often referred to as a bulletin board. And what is that? It's basically a place where any voter can send their message. And there's some guarantees of like, hey, anyone can read the bulletin board. Anyone can submit votes to it. And you might see where I'm going is like, I think it turns out the most secure way to actually implement a bulletin board, this kind of vague research concept, is to use an existing blockchain, right? Like blockchains like Ethereum have been running for, coming up on a decade, never had downtime, right? They've been tried and true, and I think that gets into the reason we see blockchain voting as compelling is like, at the end of the day, blockchains are all about process integrity, right? Like, if you write and deploy a program on a blockchain, you have certain assurances that it will run and execute according to some pre-agreed code. No one can prevent that execution, right? No one can tamper with it. No one can, block others from, say, submitting votes. Everyone can view and verify the results in a very transparent manner. You can start to see it provides a lot of these guarantees that traditional processes and systems just can't offer. And if you check out, say, like Solidity documentation, a smart contract programming language in Ethereum, one of the first examples is like, hey, let's build a voting application. And if you look with like under 50 lines of code, you can implement a voting application. I wrote this myself, and you can see there's like a vote function that just adds to a vote count. So we might say like, boom, blockchains solve it, done and done. But we do have some problems. And I would say the main one is that Ethereum and most public blockchains in production today, right, are by default completely transparent, which means, hey, this is great because we can verify, we can track the accountability of these things, but all data is public, so everyone can see exactly how you voted, which we talked about makes bribery extremely easy. We have these digital signatures that prove who this is from. We could very easily just like send someone an Etherscan link and say, yeah, like here, I voted for you, pay me. We can even build smart contracts to automate this process. And this will obviously kind of break blockchain voting if we want to uphold these security guarantees. And people warned about this pretty early on. This is a paper from 2018 basically saying like, hey, on-chain vote buying's super easy. Sellout DAO is a fun little story about an ETH Berlin hackathon a few years ago. With Moloch DAO, which was an early DAO funding public goods in Ethereum. And one of the members hacked on this web app and smart contract that basically says like, hey, you can bribe me, just send me some ETH. And he wrote a smart contract, he delegated his voting power to the smart contract, and you can see he just has like a public buy function that says, hey, send me 0.5 ETH, and you can create proposals, and you can vote on my behalf. You don't have to trust me. You don't have to take my word for it. You don't even have to know me. You can just buy me. And I think that's a simple example, but the hacker Mariano raised a really interesting point, which is the need for private on-chain voting if this stuff is actually going to work. So if we think about Ethereum compared to some of these other options, it provides correct execution. We have these nice guarantees about censorship resistance, but privacy is not available out of the box. And as a result, collusion resistance, a major, major issue. So can we solve this stuff? I think there's many different ways to implement this, and there's many different projects trying to solve this problem, which is great. But like in short, the way many of us view it is like more cryptography is the answer. And at least for now, zero-knowledge proofs can be a great way to accomplish that. So most of you have probably heard of ZK, hopefully by this point. Really interesting technology, has great powerful features for blockchains. It's basically a way of proving some fact without actually revealing all the information of the fact. And a couple like common examples, right? Maybe you know the solution to a puzzle, but you don't want to reveal the entire solution. You want to prove you're 18 to get into a bar, but you don't want to show someone your exact birth date. Maybe you want to take a loan from a financial institution. This technology gives you the power to prove, according to my financial institution, of like, hey, I have Y amount of assets in my bank account without having to show you my entire financial history. So really powerful technology that we think we can apply to this use case to provide some of these nice properties. And we think this could kind of unlock this holy grail of like, how can we provide all these important properties to a voting system? And one implementation that I'm working on currently is called MACI, and that stands for Minimal Anti-Collusion Infrastructure. And how does MACI go about this? WTF is MACI. In short, it's an on-chain voting system. We try to add privacy and that collusion resistance I just talked about. It was proposed by some guy a few years ago. R&D has been funded since by the Ethereum Foundation. It's basically an application powered by smart contracts and ZK circuits. It's open source software anyone can take off the shelf and use and deploy. And what it provides is on-chain voting, but private on-chain voting, and provides the public and transparency we think is really useful in terms of the on-chain results. Like, what are the actual results in a verifiable way? So we think this combination helps give us the best of both worlds, essentially. So getting into how MACI works, there's a couple roles. There's basically, the voter in the system, obviously. And we have this role known as the coordinator. And this would be someone actually like deploying this system and operating, say, an election. So let's take a look at how it works. Say we got an election coming up. We're all really excited. We got the user and the coordinator that I just described. First thing is the coordinator is going to deploy this set of smart contracts on chain, and this can be deployed to like any EVM chain. What the user is going to do is create a shared secret, much like we use encryption to connect with websites securely on the internet today. They're going to use that secret to create a vote and then encrypt that vote. And that encrypted vote is what gets submitted on chain. So on chain, anyone can see the transaction taking place, vanilla Ethereum or blockchain stuff. But as you can see, the actual data within that vote is encrypted and not decipherable by anyone, right? So you got a bunch of people submitting votes, going through the election. Some time passes, right? Some deadline is hit. Some election ends. Once that election process is done, what the coordinator will do is query the votes, just like anyone can, because it's a public blockchain. But they have the unique ability to decrypt those votes and tally them in some off-chain process. Once they process and tally those votes, what they do is essentially submit a commitment to the results using a ZK proof that basically guarantees that they did not tamper with the results, they calculated them correctly, they didn't censor anyone, they didn't double count anything, and it gives people that nice public on-chain result of how things went down. So there we go. Elections on chain. So if we look at where are we now, as I mentioned, this stuff started as an ETH research post. There's on-chain open source audited code that projects are using today to launch on-chain voting processes. Projects like ClearFund here in the screenshot are even using it for quadratic funding projects and crowdfunding initiatives, which is essentially voting with money when there's even higher stakes around privacy and collusion and bribery. So we're basically working on the system. We have a team and an open source community building it out. That's great because the technology still is early, right? Zero knowledge proofs, blockchains. there are some current trust assumptions involved. If you kind of notice that flow of like this coordinator, this person operating the role, does have some power to decrypt the results. And like they could, bribe people with that information if they're malicious. That information could leak. So there's ways we're building out solutions to that, which is great. But currently there still are some trust assumptions with this stuff. So where we're at today, probably something more like this. But I think, particularly within the next couple years, I think we'll definitely get into a place where like this is a much more compelling solution than anything else in existence. We've been running experiments with projects to do on-chain voting, on-chain quadratic funding, and we're actively looking for more people to work with. Where do we think we're going? I mean, we think Macy or some iteration of this can build the most secure e-voting system in the world. Ambitious vision, but we think this technology makes it possible. How do we get there? Like I said, I think starting with Ethereum native projects, blockchain projects, people and users who are used to, using wallets, using this technology, like QF initiatives, like DAO governance. I mean, if we look, here's a screenshot of just like some on-chain treasuries, right? Organizations with billions of dollars at stake. We're already working with some of them, such as like the Optimism Foundation, to say like, hey, you do retro PGF, grant rounds of $100 million. Clearly, you want some security guarantees that people aren't cheating or being bribed. So we're looking to start there, but starting to also have conversations with some, forward-looking, innovative municipalities of like, could we actually use this stuff in the real world and get real people using this stuff? So the hope is that, next time we're all here in Belgrade together, these elections will be happening on chain. Thanks. If I have time, happy to take questions. How are we doing on time?
Questions is good.
We got time. All right.
Hi, Sam. Thank you so much for your presentation. You mentioned a lot of, and it seems to be the perfect use case to have, like real-world voting for governments, for national elections, municipalities, and so on. But what's interesting to see, and this is like more to hear your thoughts on that, is that actually most of the countries that are part of the European Union are going on elections this weekend. So over 30 states will be voting for the parliament. And we've been seeing more and more the turnout in Europe very, very low. So it's always around 35. Last month in Portugal for the national elections, we had actually an above average, which for them is 49% to go to the ballots and vote. And I can see the technology can support at a certain extent, but I wonder, besides the accessibility and also the trust that this new technology can bring, what do you think that could actually help people, to think about and go vote?
Great question. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, at least from my perspective, I've definitely been focused on the infrastructure of this stuff. And I think getting engagement with election and participation, super important, not stuff we're currently like focused on solving. I mean, I'm at least hopeful with just like moving more things and more services online and digital that will help, right? If you're an expat, if you're in the military, you can vote remotely. To be able to vote from your phone obviously unlocks, hopefully, a lot of chances to improve participation. But yeah, I think part of it's also just education, right? Of just like, at least where I live in the US, I think a lot of people have become apathetic just because they don't think their vote matters. They don't trust the system. I think there's just a lot of misinformation in the space. So I am hopeful that like if we could get government adoption of this stuff and education around this of like why this technology is so powerful, how it does actually guarantee a lot of these processes that we haven't been able to guarantee before, that people can buy in and get excited about like, okay, like my vote will be counted, and I know for sure that's true. But yeah, it's a tough problem, right? We can't solve everything at once.
Hey, Sam, this was really great. I guess what I'm wondering is, what do you think will be the biggest challenge? Because obviously, in an ideal scenario, we want people to care about elections, and we want the government to acknowledge the results of these elections, not having these like stop the steal, bullshit things going on. So what do you think will be the biggest challenge when it comes to humanity's sort of desire for power? I foresee that we'll definitely have some opposition from people who are used to kind of like managing the strings. Like, I'll give you a quick example. I've lived in the US and New Hampshire for years, but also I'm from Eastern Europe. And in my little hometown, there's a person that always wins the election. And the anecdote is that they're like hiding like bags of votes, and it's all done very manually. So how do you think we can overcome humans' desire for power at whatever cost to even be able to integrate this technology to get people to trust in the system again and create a better future?
Yeah, great question. Another big problem that I probably can't answer. I mean, I think the biggest obstacle is probably just political will, of just like you say, of like the people in power are probably pretty happy with how things are going right now, and like how easy it is to, say, bribe voters. But I think that tide is changing, and people are somewhat hungry for these solutions. I was in Block Split in Croatia last week, and we met with some folks from the Parliament of Croatia, and they're seeing examples in the wild, not specifically of blockchain voting, but of like Estonia that's been running digital elections for like a decade now. And they've brought in members from the Estonia government to teach them and show workshops, and I think there is mounting pressure, partly driven by just like the economy going digital, governments now kind of like competing with each other for talent, for tax dollars, and I think you'll see like competition over government services broadly becoming something that there's just more pressure and conversation around. But I think it will take people and just like political will to say like, hey, we actually want this thing. The other piece, I think, is just like proving it in smaller stakes environments. Like when I was also out in Croatia, I met with someone who like works at the local football club, and they do digital elections. And like everyone in the city knows about the football club. And if we can get an organization like that to adopt it, get people using the technology and comfortable with it, and demonstrate, hey, this stuff works, we think that will raise awareness and raise demand for people asking questions of like, hey, if our football club can do it, like, why can't our city government do this? How are we doing? Thank you, guys.
What a session, guys. What a session. And for time purposes, we do have to jump into the next one, but I'm sure everyone can grab you after if they want to ask any further questions. And did you share your Twitter handle, everything like that, so people can contact you?
Sam on Chain on Twitter. And yeah, I'll be floating if you guys want to chat.
I got a couple questions, but we just don't have time for it.
We'll
so
talk.
I'll be speaking to you after, man. Great to connect, brother.